Beneath the glittering skin of Hong Kong, behind the forest of skyscrapers that pierce the clouds, lies a hidden world. This is not a prison cell, but a home. A space of just 2 square meters, the dimensions of a telephone booth, is where a life is lived. This is one of the city's infamous coffin homes. For more than 200,000 people, this is reality. One shared bathroom for 20 residents. A life compressed into a box. This is the consequence of a city that has physically run out of space, leaving a vast population with no choice but to inhabit cages. In this vertical metropolis, the average home costs an astonishing 18 times the average family's yearly income, creating the most severe housing crisis on the planet. As millions are forced into these impossibly small spaces, another story has been unfolding in the penthouses above. Last year, the wealthiest 10% of households earned 82 times more than the poorest 10%, a chasm of inequality that has more than doubled in just 5 years. At the center of this economic vortex are 4 families. Through their sprawling conglomerates, they dominate the skyline and the lives beneath it. With a combined net worth exceeding $100 billion, they control over half of all private housing, commanding land reserves and assets larger than the city's entire annual gross domestic product. While the city suffocates, they are accused of manipulating the supply of land, driving prices ever higher into the stratosphere. This is the story of a gleaming, prosperous city, built upon a dystopian foundation, a society governed by a secretive few. His name is Kai. At 60 years old, he is a cleaner in the crowded district of Mong Kok. His home is a bedbug-infested section of a room, measuring just 20 square feet, for which he pays $300 a month. For him, even this is a refuge from the alternative, eviction, with no resettlement, no safety net, forch for more than a decade. This landscape of desperation was not born overnight. It was engineered, built upon decisions made long ago. To understand how one of Asia's wealthiest cities forces so many of its own to live in cages, we must look back to its very foundation. Modern Hong Kong was born of war. The British did not inherit it, they seized it. With that conquest came a new and absolute rule. Disregarding all that came before, a decree was made. All land would be owned by the government, then leased out to individuals and businesses. It was a single decision, made in the year 1841, that would echo through the centuries, an act of colonial administration that still dictates the price of rent, the shape of a home, and the boundaries of a life, even now, in the 21st century. The walls of the cage were not built today. Their bars were forged in the crucible of empire, a legacy of power that continues to define who is allowed to live and who must merely survive. From the ashes of the Second World War, a new metropolis was poised to rise. On the edge of a continent in revolutionary turmoil, Hong Kong, a harbor of possibility, became a crucible of change. As mainland China convulsed, a tide of humanity turned south. Fleeing political upheaval, they carried not just their belongings, but an unyielding entrepreneurial spirit and a vast capacity for labor, fueling an unprecedented economic engine. Through the 1950s and 60s, the city's skyline became a forest of factories. From textiles to electronics, the label "Made in Hong Kong" became a global stamp of relentless industry. The results were staggering. Gross domestic product multiplied 20-fold in less than 2 decades. A coastal outpost had transformed into a capitalist titan, roaring alongside Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore as one of the 4 legendary Asian tigers. But growth at such a velocity creates its own fragility. By the 1980s, the hum of the factory floor began to fade. A new economic gravity was pulling industry northward to the vast, untapped markets of the mainland. To survive, Hong Kong had to reinvent itself. It turned from manufacturing goods to manufacturing wealth. The city leveraged its reputation, transforming its concrete canyons into corridors of global finance. By the 1990s, the migration was no longer of laborers, but of capital. More than 10,000 firms a year established a presence, cementing Hong Kong's status as a world-leading financial nexus. Yet, an inescapable deadline loomed. As the clock ticked towards 1997 and the end of British rule, a deep uncertainty settled over the city. The prospect of control by a communist regime triggered a primal fear in the heart of the capitalist enclave. The response was swift: capital flight. Investors pulled vast sums from the territory, and within months, the Hang Seng Index plunged by over 20%. As this political transition convulsed the city, a wider economic contagion spread. The Asian financial crisis struck, a second devastating blow. But beneath the shocks of politics and finance, a more fundamental pressure was building: a crisis of space. Confined to just over 1,000 square kilometers of unforgiving terrain, Hong Kong was being crushed by its own success. By 1999, its population density had soared past 6,000 people per square kilometer, 150 times the global average, dwarfing even London and New York. The population had nearly tripled, but the land had stayed the same. Housing, the most basic of human needs, became an impossible luxury. This was the era that gave rise to the city's most haunted paradox: the cage home. Tiny wire mesh compartments crammed into overcrowded flats. What began in the 1950s as a temporary fix for the migrant boom had become a lasting metallic symbol of a city whose ambitions had outgrown its foundations. For even as a metropolis builds its fortunes to the heavens, its soul is measured by the lives of those who dwell in its shadows. As property values spiraled into the stratosphere, the dream of owning a home evaporated for the ordinary worker. It was an economic disparity that would soon curdle into something far more sinister. A system already unequal was about to become fundamentally rigged. When sovereignty passed from London to Beijing, Hong Kong was a city of immense potential, yet burdened by colonial imperfections. There was an expectation of change, a hope that its archaic housing policies would be dismantled. But the architecture of empire designed for extraction was not torn down. It was adopted and then perfected. In the maelstrom of a financial crash, the city's new government was desperate for a lifeline. They needed to stabilize a reeling economy and reassure a nervous populace. Their solution was not reform, but reinforcement. They doubled down on the existing model, slashing the top rate of income tax from 25% to a mere 16%. The theory was simple. Lower taxes would ignite consumer spending and keep the economic engine roaring. But it created a cavernous void in the public purse. The city still had to function. Its buses, its trains, its schools all required state funding. With revenues plummeting, a fiscal crisis loomed. In this moment of desperation, officials turned back to the colonial playbook. They began to liquidate the one asset they controlled completely, the land itself. Vast tracts of government-owned territory were sold off to the highest bidder, a torrent of land auctions that generated an astonishing $20 billion each year. For the state, it was the perfect solution. These sales alone accounted for more than 10% of the entire government budget, enough to fund the city's entire public health care system. The formula was dangerously simple. Keep selling the land, and the money would never stop. But this was a gold rush for a chosen few. For the average citizen, even affording rent was a struggle. The prospect of buying land was pure fantasy. A new class of landowner was being forged in the crucible of this policy, an elite who could afford the city's ever-rising price. The ground beneath the people's feet was being sold, creating a city of tenants in a landscape owned by ghosts, forever altering the soul of the metropolis. In the tectonic shifts of power, new empires are forged. As one era gives way to another, vacuums are created, and into them the ambitious ascend. In Hong Kong, a city caught between worlds, a seismic change presented an opportunity of a lifetime. As the government began to sell off its land at an unprecedented rate, a small, ultra-wealthy elite saw their moment. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, a handful of powerful families began to tighten their grip on the very foundations of the city. Over time, 4 names would rise above all others: the Kwok, the Li, and the Cheng. Their dominion began with real estate, but it would not end there. With near infinite wealth, they wove intricate webs of influence, forging powerful ties with both the Hong Kong government and authorities on the Chinese mainland. In theory, the city ran on the principles of free market capitalism. But in the reality of steel and concrete, housing was no market at all. It was a cartel, controlled by a select few. Their dominance was not merely about property. It was about the power to bend an entire metropolis to their will. Together, these 4 families have amassed a combined net worth exceeding $100 billion, a fortune greater than the entire gross domestic product of some nations. But their true currency is not measured in dollars. It is measured in leverage. Leverage over the market, over the media, and over the government itself. With such power, the question is not if. It will be used for profit. But how? For years, these developers have mastered the art of market manipulation. They strategically limit the release of new apartments, engineering a state of perpetual scarcity. As supply is choked, prices are driven ever higher. This artificial drought translates into staggering profit margins, among the highest in the world. While den margins around 15%, these Hong Kong firms routinely enjoy returns of 30 to 50%, raking in billions year after year. Their control over supply does more than inflate balance sheets. It ensures that for millions, the dream of a home remains an unattainable luxury. To push their profits to the absolute limit, the very definition of a home has been compressed. With no meaningful competition to challenge them, a new dystopian architecture has emerged, the nano-flat. Some measure as little as 120 square feet, barely enough room for a bed and a sink. These concrete boxes, once unthinkable, are now a common feature of new developments. For an estimated 220,000 people, this is not an abstract crisis. It is the four walls of their reality. They are the human cost of a skyline built for profit, living within the confines of an empire that has reshaped not only the city's landscape, but the very nature of the lives lived within it. In the corridors of power, where decisive action is demanded, the immense political weight of vested interests creates a state of paralysis. Policies governing the land itself remain tilted in their favor, while the fundamental needs of the public, affordable, dignified housing, are perpetually deferred. The data reveals a chasm, stark and unforgiving. In the last year, the wealthiest 10% of households earned 82 times more than the poorest 10%. Just 5 years prior, that figure was half as large. For more than a decade, the Gini Index has placed this city among the 10 most unequal territories on Earth. It has now eclipsed every other nation in a continent already defined by its wealth divides. Within a metropolis of 8 million souls, a mere 80 individuals command 11% of its entire wealth. It is a concentration of capital more extreme than that found in Russia or South Africa, nations long considered paragons of inequality. Here, the affluent grow wealthier through the passive ownership of assets, while the working class wages the desperate daily battle simply to keep a roof over their heads. As the value of property ascends into the stratosphere, the gap between the landed and the landless becomes a wound in the fabric of society. Economists, searching for a word to describe this paradoxical system, have given it a name: Pluto-communism. Despite a rising tide of public outcry, the government's response has been defined by silence, its actions minimal, its solutions illusory. In 2024, the chief executive announced reforms for subdivided housing. The news made headlines, but the city's infamous Coffin homes were explicitly excluded from the legislation, leaving the most inhumane living conditions entirely legal and thriving. The concept of rent control was dismissed, with officials claiming it would interfere with the sanctity of the market. there were no relocation plans, no safety nets, only a silent understanding. For those who could not keep up, the cage was the only option left. But this crisis is not a law of nature. It is a story of choice. Other cities, facing similar pressures, have chosen a different path. Consider Singapore, a city-state with a population density mirroring Hong Kong's, yet a world away from its housing nightmare. Decades ago, its government made a deliberate choice. It established the Housing and Development Board, an entity that today builds and manages over 80% of all homes, ensuring high-quality, affordable shelter for citizens of all income levels. With public housing as the bedrock of the market, private developers found little room to exploit the vulnerable. South Korea offers another model. There, the free market operates, but it is not without restraint. To curb the hoarding of properties by the ultra-wealthy, the state introduced a formidable property gains tax, claiming up to 50% of profits from those who own multiple homes. The solutions are not a mystery. Experts have laid out the blueprints for reform time and again, broaden the tax base, increase the supply of land, and enforce absolute transparency. The knowledge exists. The precedents have been set. All that remains is the question of will and the moral calculus of a society deciding what and who it is willing to leave behind. Every suggestion was ignored. Every warning went unheeded, for meaningful change would have meant confronting the architects of the crisis, the billionaires who profited from the city's pain. And so, the burden was allowed to fall, as it always does, upon the people, a population crushed by the weight of impossible rents and ever-shrinking spaces, governed by a system that had decisively chosen wealth over welfare. The cost is now measured not just in dollars, but in lives. In 2023, more than 1,000 souls were lost to suicide across Hong Kong, an average of 3 people a day, ending their own lives, no longer able to bear the suffering. For generations, this city was a testament to a powerful idea, that hard work led to success. It was a promise that drew immigrants, entrepreneurs, and laborers, all believing that with enough effort, they could carve out a better life. That promise is now dead. The housing crisis has sealed the exits on social mobility. A university graduate entering the workforce today would need to save every single penny of their salary for nearly 20 years just to afford the down payment on a microscopic apartment. Even seasoned professionals with stable careers are trapped, living with their parents well into their 30s or crammed into shared micro-flats, their ambitions confined by the same 4 walls as their bodies. It is a reality so bleak that over 80% of Hong Kong's youth believe they will never own a home. For many, the only choice left is to leave. Between 2020 and 2022, 140,000 people, mostly young, educated professionals, fled the city, searching for a future that no longer existed there. This is not a uniquely Hong Kong story. It is a cautionary tale for the world. From Singapore to London, from New York to Toronto, the same forces of real estate monopolization and extreme inequality are at work, when housing ceases to be about shelter and becomes a mere investment vehicle for the global elite. The foundation of society begins to crack. This is the inevitable result of a system built to protect wealth and power, whatever the human cost. What began as a colonial land grab has simply evolved, refined under new rulers, but rooted in the same inexorable logic. Extract as much as possible from the many to enrich the few. Inequality here was never an accident. It was engineered. Today, billionaires command empires of land from their penthouses in the sky, while the working class is packed into metal boxes below. This is the warning. If we continue to allow the basic human need for shelter to be a tool for speculation, if we accept this chasm of inequality as the price of progress, then Hong Kong's present is destined to become everyone's future. It is a future being built one tiny apartment, one broken dream at a time.